أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so today I want to make a video talking about Islamic integralism or Islamic intellectualism and the best uh, thoughts or the best of Islamic thought in the Muslim world currently, or also an overview of the concerns, the intellectual concerns or the philosophical concerns of the Muslim world. So I have a couple of intentions for creating this series of videos. Number one, I do feel Islamic responsibility to my God to call the integral community to Quranic Islam. Number one, as a Muslim. Number two, I'm pursuing a legal matter, and so I want a record of my coherent philosophical thought and my coherent articulation and my coherent rationality, and a record of my philosophical work. Like, there is philosophical work that I've been engaged in, and that it is comprehensive, coherent, vast, detailed, and therefore clearly the product of obsessive amounts of time and energy going into reflection, right, and research. So those two things, and also because what I'm asking for in the legal matter has to do with my identity, which cannot be understood without my philosophical thought being, apparent, and therefore I just want almost like a confession of my identity. So I've been through this. I've been doing this in the Urdu language. I've been through the whole comprehensive expression of my thought in Urdu for purposes of presenting myself to particular teachers there. But now I want to go through it in the English language, right? And so, for the integral audience, let me just say, for me, for me as a Muslim with integral cognition, my most authentic or integrous way of engaging in life is, I believe that there is Sharia, which is divinely revealed, and it has the constants of human experience within it. And then there's a vast domain of, mundane life that we have freedom to engage with. And so that would be the domain where I would engage integral life practice. Now, there's more nuance to it, but that's a simple way of understanding it. Now, let me begin with methodology. So I'm going to start with, let me give you an overview. I'm going to start with a methodology. I'm going to lay out the way to deduce and induce from the textual sources of Islam and name the textual sources of Islam, so you understand kind of my methodology. And then we're going to talk about four content domains in which to apply that methodology. And so those four content domains, let me tell you a hadith or a story from the Prophet's life which explains those four content domains. And so at the end of the Prophet's life, there appeared in Medina a man wearing pure white. He had jet black hair. He was very handsome, and he was like illuminated, and he had pure white clothing, and no one knew him. And despite the fact that no one knew him, he didn't have the marks of travel upon him. So this is 1400 years ago. A man has appeared. There's no horse around. He doesn't look like he's been riding. There's no apparent, like, he's just there all of a sudden, and no one knows him. And so he comes up, the Prophet is sitting with his companions in his majlis or in his gathering, and this man just comes up to him and very intimate, sits down Indian style on the ground the way the Prophet is sitting, and joins his knees to the knees of the Prophet, right, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he starts asking the Prophet a series of questions. And the response to these questions, so first he asks him, what is Ihsan? And Ihsan means, it means to beautify, is the best translation, right? To beautify. And so, or to just technically, to translate this more technically, it's to theosophy. Within the context of Islam, it means to theosophy, to make godly, but in lexically, it means to beautify. So he asks him, what does it mean to beautify? And he says, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see him. And if you cannot worship him as if you see him, then at least know that he sees you. Then at least if you cannot worship him the way as if you see him, if you cannot worship him as if you see him, then worship him as if knowing that he sees you, knowing that he sees you, right? And then he asks him, what is iman? So what is faith, basically, or what is fidelity? Faith would be uh, I guess it's often translated as belief, but belief is a wrong translation. Faith would be the most kind of common usage sort of translation, but lexically, and my preference is lexical or etymological. I mean, is fidelity. What is fidelity, right? And so the Prophet says fidelity is to have faith in Allah, His angels, His books, His prophets, the Day of Judgment, and destiny, taqdir, the good and the bad. Right? It's predestined. It's all predestined. And so to believe in destiny, that's the sixth core Islamic belief, right? And so then the man asks the Prophet, what is Islam? And so the Prophet says it's to testify that there is no deity except for the deity, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger. And then to establish the salah, which is basically what Father Thomas Keating talks about. Keating talks about centering prayer. That is basically salah, right? That is what Muslims are supposed to be doing 5 times a day, right? I'm not saying they all are doing that when they do it like externally, but that is exactly precisely it, right? So the salah, and then it is to fast 1 month of Ramzan every year, and fourth is to give zakah, which is to third is to give zakah, fourth is fasting, third is zakah, which is I think 2.5% of your savings every year. Any money you have saved, or any commodity, or any like reserve that you have saved for over a year, you pay 2.5% tax on that. To anyways, and then lastly is the Hajj, right? The Hajj, the pilgrimage once in a lifetime to go to Mecca and make the Hajj pilgrimage and do all the rituals involved with it. Okay, so this is Islam. And then he asks him, and when is the Day of Judgment? Right? The fourth question is, when is the Day of Judgment? And the Prophet replies, the one asking doesn't know, and the one being asked doesn't know any better than the one asking. The one being asked doesn't know any better than the one asking. And the implication is that only God knows. So this is a big point in Islamic theology. It's universal, Shia, Sunni, Muhakkama, that only God himself knows the Day of Judgment. The angels carrying the throne of God do not know the day or the time of the Day of Judgment. Only God knows the time of the Day of Judgment, right? Only he knows. It's something that only Gabriel doesn't know, Michael doesn't know. No one knows except for him, right? So that's his reply. And then the next thing is, so the man goes away, or the man disappears. And so a few days later, or immediately after, the Prophet asked the man who became the second caliph, who was a companion of the Prophet at the time, he asks him, "O Umar, do you know who he is? Do you know who that was?" And he says, "No, Allah and His Messenger know better, and so know best." And so the Prophet replies that that was Gabriel. That was Gabriel who came to teach you your religion. That was Gabriel who came to teach you your deen. Deen lexically means exchange, and technically it means politeia. Politeia is English, you could say constitution, but constitution in the English usage, not in the American usage, right? So politeia is the best translation of deen. So he came to teach you your politeia, or your way, right? And so deen, basically Islam is a deen. It's a politeia. It is not a religion. You could call it a religious politeia, but it is a deen, right? So basically what this means is that he came to teach your deen. This whole event happened toward the end of the Prophet's life, where the revelation over 23 years had been revealed mostly, and the purpose of establishing an Islamic state in Medina and in the Arabian Peninsula had been accomplished, right? So that had been accomplished. So this was a review. Gabriel came down, and by asking these four very comprehensive questions, a systematic expression to summarize the revelation over 23 years was given to the Ummah as a gift, to the community of the Prophet as a gift, right? Or as a teaching, or as a kindness from God. God sent Gabriel to elicit this sort of teaching from the Prophet, right? So this hadith, or this story, this event from the Prophet's life, is known the Sunnah. It's known as the Ummul Sunnah, which means the mother of the Sunnah, or the mother of the way of the Prophet. Meaning, it's very comprehensive, right? Like it brings like Islamic spirituality, Islamic theology, Islamic practice, and Islamic worldview, right? It's all kind of systematically laid out, right? So now the question becomes, what is the proper relationship? What is to be prioritized? What is to be prioritized at what stage, etc., right? So for me, and now we're going to systematically go through these four questions now that you have kind of this as a preface, right? My thought regarding these. So first, for me, I believe that the spiritual aspect, isan, or beautification, or to beautify, is the most profound and the most fundamental. It comes even before faith. So a sort of existential being knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is, for me, I believe it to be a natural monotheism that exists within Adamic nature, to embody that, and the character that is in accord with that, the morality that's in accord with that, is the most important thing. So religion is revealed to someone who already has that, right? Like revelation comes to someone who is already embodying that sort of character, and then God articulates through inspiration the correct belief systems, the correct practice. And so there's a way, even before you um, engage in practicing the law, you need that sort of spiritual abiding with God. You need that spiritual abiding with God. And for me, the whole 23-year period of the Prophet's life, where he received initial revelation, and then he gave he's basically, people have called him, Western scholarship has called him, a street preacher in Mecca and a warlord in Medina. Now that's a Western way of looking at it, but it shows you some truth, right? It shows you that there was radical nonviolence. In fact, Gandhi attributed radical nonviolence to the Muslims in Mecca, right, under the Prophet. And then you have kind of Alexander the Great sort of like, conquests afterwards, after in Medina, right? And so, regarding this radical nonviolence, what I believe is that during this time, the initial phase, you have to have a sublime morality. You have to have sublime character. And this character and morality is actually knowledge of God, right? And so the whole process is going from, it's going from it's increasing you in your gnosis, in your Gnosticism, in your gnosis of God, in your knowledge of God. So by the end, when the state is established, a godly state is established, that is the state in which the gnosis within the subjectivity of the faithful is the highest, it is the most complete, it is the most perfect, right? That is when the gnosis is most complete. But you need some sort of foundational gnosis even at the beginning, right? So you need some sort of foundational gnosis. So you have to have an iconoclastic attitude to idolatry, to false worship. This is kind of via negativa. This is the Buddhist path, like Osho talks about, via negativa and via positiva. So this is kind of like the Buddhist path, right? At the beginning, you need the Buddhist path. You need the negation of everything, right? You need kind of like the Zen sword to cut through all idolatry, all falsity, all wrong perception. It's to achieve the emptiness, right? The emptiness. And when you attain to the emptiness, then you go through a process of realizing the fullness of God, right? So first you have to have the emptiness at the very beginning, and you have to have some positive, via positiva, some faith in Allah or God, and then you go through a process of fulfilling that gnosis, like attaining the highest gnosis. And the idea is that the highest gnosis of God, the highest theosis of the individual, the highest theosis of the community, and the highest theosis of the children of Adam, and the highest theosis of the earth can only be attained when there is a godly state, right? That is when justice is established, divine justice is established. There's the garden is in some way recreated, right? So when that happens, that is when you have the ultimate gnosis that is possible in this life. And the whole point of creation or evolution, as the intentional evolution as the manner of creation, is to attain to that perfect gnosis or that perfect theosis of creation through the struggle of the children of Adam, right? So that's the whole point of creation, right? And so there's four phases to this process in the Prophet's lifetime and in the early Muslims' lifetime, which corresponds to the four questions asked by the angel Gabriel, and corresponds to a jurisprudence of the final jihad that Muslims have to go through in the final era, right? That Muslims have to go through in the final era. So again, the initial stage is this gnosis, this having some gnosis of God, uh, with perfect via negativa, with perfect iconoclasticism, but imperfect or incomplete positive gnosis, right, of the being of God, of the deity, right? Imperfect, or at least, if not imperfect, incomplete, or not at the highest level necessarily, because the whole point is that the outward struggle creates the circumstances in which the gnosis can increase over time. It can be completed, it can be perfected, right? Okay, so that's stage one, where basically the early Islamic revelation is feed the poor, give water to the thirsty, give money to the poor, and establish the salah, the word, the 5 times daily worship, to establish worship, to know God, to remember God, to worship God, to fear God, to love God, that is, and the names of God, right? The names of God, and then the names of the revelation itself. What is revelation itself? These sort of fundamental questions regarding Isan or Gnosis or beautification or theosification are the initial stages of the Islamic revelation. And then secondly, you go into this phase where you have, and there's people who respond to this initial phase, and these are the best people. These are what we call Salim Al-Fitra in Islam. It means like Salam, Shalom, right? It means wholeness or peace. Uh, so the person who has wholeness of nature, right? They're sound in their nature. They're already moral people. They're already godly in some way. And so they initially respond to this phase of the revelation. These are the people who convert very early on in the revolutionary process, right? In the theosification process. Then, secondly, you have people who need some sort of intellectual rationality or intellectualism or rational, coherent thought around the state of gnosis, right? They need some sort of articulation of the gnosis. And so, this is when you have the six branches of faith, right? God, the angels, the books, the prophets, the final day of judgment, and destiny, right? So these six phases. So the second phase, which is still in Mecca, right? So there's two big phases, Mecca and Medina. Each has two sub phases, Isan, Iman, Islam, and the days, the signs of the day of judgment. So we're in the second phase in Mecca right now, right? So you need some sort of articulation. So what is the nature of the universe, right? So you have to talk about angels and the divine order and the cosmos. You have to talk about so this is the type of revelation you see in late Mecca, right? And you see revelation about previous prophets, and you see revelation about the nature of revelation and the books and the previous books like the Torah and the Injil. For example, Allah says, Alif Lam Mim, لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم نزل الكتاب مصدقا لما بين يديه وأنزل التوراة والإنجيل. And so the Torah and the Evangelion, or the Gospel, right? So this is the second phase of revelation. And then the third phase of revelation is when the Muslims are exercising radical nonviolence throughout Mecca, but despite that, their message is disruptive to not only to the idolatry of the pagans, but also to the pagan Arabs, but also to the fact that their business is based upon the fact that the shrine of idolatry for all of Arabia is in Mecca. And so when they're disrupting idolatrous practices, they're actually disrupting the economic interests of the Arabs of Mecca, right? So there's all sorts of social upheaval. So they're being persecuted. So they migrate. At a certain point, God gives them permission, and they migrate to Medina. Now, this migration is significant because in Islam, we believe that all prophets have this process of migration. First, they establish proof. They call their people to Islam or to monotheism, and at some point, what happens is that the proof is established against them. And so, once the proof is established against the proof is established against the people, and God has separated out the faithful, the fidelitous, from the hypocrites or the self-delusional, right? So the self-delusional and the faithful are separated out. God causes the faithful or commands them to migrate away. And so when the separation becomes physical, there's a physical separation. God then proceeds to destroy the people who have caused these people to go away, the faithful to go away, right? So the faithful then go settle somewhere, and then for a time they have a garden-like state, right? They have a garden-like state under their prophet, and eventually they mess up too, and then generations go by and they become the bad people, so this happens over and over again. So that migration has that significance that this is when God is going to destroy the people who are left behind, and he's going to give victory to the people, or victory or triumph or blessing to the people who have migrated, right? So but there's something distinct about, so this is how this migration is like the migration of every community, of every prophet that has preceded. But there's also something different about this migration, which this is the final prophet, right? This is the complete establishment of proof by God upon all of humanity. And so in our times, there's really not going to be a place where, God is saying that, first off, humanity is mature. So he doesn't really want to send like overt miracles like fire from heaven, or parting the seas, but he wants more subtle sort of miracles that the faithful will triumph despite there being no apparent miracle of that kind. They will triumph in the face of overwhelming odds, and in that triumph, God will be evident, right? God will be evident in that, kind of like the American Revolution, right? So they go, but there's nothing that descends from heaven to destroy the other people, but it is the faithful themselves who are then strengthened by God, who are made gradually to struggle militarily to overcome the pagans or the idolaters. And if you study the idolatry of the pagans, there's a lot of injustice, right? There was immense amounts of injustice in that. So it was not just about the idolatry, it was the social consequences of that idolatry, of that paganism, right? And so eventually the Muslims overcome, and they open Mecca, or they conquer Mecca. And then once Mecca is open, all of Arabia follows. and Islam is established, right? So in the third phase in Medina, that is when you're getting the third phase, meaning of the four phases, the third phase, or the first phase in Medina, the third phase overall, you're getting revelation about. That's where you get law. So you don't have law in Mecca. 13 years in Mecca, you don't have law. You have worship God, do moral acts, be good to people. You have ethics, and then you have the single worship, right? Pray to God, worship God in the way you see Muslims doing, right? The salah. You have that, but you don't have law. But in Medina, is the first phase of Medina is when you get the whole law. A lot of social regulation is in there, regarding marriage, how to enact divorce, how to contract marriage, how to deal with inheritance issues, all these sort of things. You have to do in Medina, right? Is all these sort of communal regulations. There's not a lot of guidance on political structure, right? That's left fairly loose. But there is a lot in, like, interest is unlawful, right? These sort of things are all in Medina. So you see, this is not the first phase of revelation. The first phase is ethics and spirituality. Then it's articulating faith. And then there is a philosophy, basically. And then there is migration. And then once you have your own community where Muslims are in power, and the people of Medina, actually, they had been warring for many generations, and so they accepted Islam, and they invited the Prophet to rule them, to establish peace between them, and to govern Medina. So there's radical nonviolence, and then you have a voluntary surrender of state power structure to the Prophet, is how the first Islamic state was established. And then during that phase, you have, like I said, all the kind of the law. You have the gradual revelation of the law. It doesn't come out at the same time. For example, I'll give you an example, like alcohol. The first revelation is don't drink when you're going to establish prayer. So if you're going to drink, don't drink like right before you're going to go pray, right? Or worship. So it's impure at the time of worship. It's not made unlawful, but if someone is praying, 3 times a day or 5 times a day, it's going to kind of make it difficult to do that. And not only that, you're supposed to pray at night, voluntarily. So it's going to make it difficult for you to drink or find time to drink, but it's not made unlawful strictly. And the second, even before that, I think one time there's like this revelation where it's bad, it's discouraged. And then you have this, it's haram, it's unlawful in the prayer. And then finally, at one point, another revelation and sentence that it's completely unlawful. So you see this gradualism in the whole revelation, but even in some things that may be difficult to enact immediately, you see this sort of gradualism in the way something is prohibited, right? So there's a wisdom to it. And then lastly, once the law is established in Arabia, and the campaigns are going out to establish Islam globally, you have this final stage where the Prophet starts to talk about, and the Quran starts to talk about, the future, right? Because the Prophet's not going to be around forever, so the future is so the signs of the Day of Judgment. So what's going to happen right before the Day of Judgment comes? Basically Armageddon type of like literature, right? So the Prophet starts talking about, the Antichrist, and like Yajuj and Majuj. It's basically this race that's going to come out, and there are going to be so many people, and we can't even imagine where these people are coming from. And they're just kind of like the Mongol hordes. They're just going to go out and just kind of just rip everything apart and just wash over the Quranic languages. They're going to wash over the earth, right? So these sort of things get talked about in the final phases of the Prophet's life as a sort of future vision, as a sort of completion, right, of what's going to happen. And also like hadiths about Islamic history. So first you're going to have people who are going to rule like the Prophet ruled. Then you're going to have kingships that are your own, but they're still unjust. And then you're going to have colonialism. There's like a hadith about this. And then it's going to return to an Islamic system, right? So you have these sort of hadiths. So these are kind of the 4 stages of revelation. And I've given you the hadith on which they're based. I've kind of grafted that on into grafted that onto the Prophet's life, so you get a short sort of biography of the struggle to theosophy Arabia as a model of the struggle to theosophy the earth. And so there's kind of work to be done in all four of these kind of domains, right? And so for me, after I was in Pakistan studying Islam for a while, I went to the Integral Center. And so once I was at the Integral Center, I got a much more nuanced perspective of, the interior and the exterior and the collective and the individual. And so I do feel like modern Sufism, and Allama Iqbal, who was the visionary of Pakistan, he was also knighted by the British royalty. This guy, he was a PhD in philosophy from Munich University, and he earned a JD from Oxford at the same time. Right, so very, very intelligent, capable person. And so he had this vision that Sufism, especially Islam in general, but Sufism in general, had a lot to learn from modern thought, modern psychology in particular. And so, definitely, integral thought for me and integral Sufism is basically the foundation. We need a sort of integral Sufism, and we need an integral analysis of the earth, an integral perception of the earth. And Islamic law or jurisprudence is actually called fiqh, which is understanding. And for me, you cannot an understanding has an understanding of the sources and an understanding of the situation. And I think without integral thought, you cannot have an understanding of the situation. You need integral thought to have an understanding of the situation. And then by having an understanding of the global situation, then you can really understand where a person is coming from. So one of the things I faced when I went to Pakistan was that I was maybe too pre-integral or integral for Pakistan and too Muslim for the integral world, too Muslim, or at the time you could say I was too American for the Muslim world and too Muslim for the American world, right? So this sort of thing where the mufti over there, the kind of the lawyer or the Islamic juris doctor, doesn't have the nuance of thought to appreciate my experience here in the United States, and he would rather just dismiss me as an unethical or immoral person or someone who doesn't understand rather than try to understand. And that's because he's at a blue level of cognition, right? He has a blue level of cognition. And so I think that we need integralism and authentic relating practices and these sort of things to really, update Sufism, right? You need that. And there's a lot of good in Sufism, like Rumi, and there's plenty of people like Rumi, right, who have beautiful books about the psychology. And you have to understand that psychology and ontology are inseparable. So for a Muslim, psychology, which basically what tasawwuf is human psychology, or Sufism is basically Muslim psychology, because we are trying to realize the identity of being a slave to God, and Abdullah. Allah is our Rabb, He's our owner, He's our Lord, He's our master, and we are His slave. So we are trying to realize the identity of being an up to Him, and then having that identity, all the proper states of being in relationship to the deity in any moment of our life, whatever is the appropriate state of being will occur once we've realized that identity, right? So we're just trying, that's what the centering prayer does for us, is we're trying to cultivate that, not only that state of awareness of Allah, but that state of identity of who we are in relationship to Allah, right? So but again, because having this model of the gradualism with which the revelation came, that at first you have ethics. You cannot have law when you're not living in a system where you're not the dominant force. You can't have your own law. You can only have your own ethics, right? You can only have your own ethics. And when you're in a place where you can have law, then you have law, right? But at the beginning, you have to have ontology and ethics, which are expressive of that ontology. You can't have law at the beginning, right? It doesn't work. It's meaningless. It's impossible to enact, and that's the wisdom of it, right? You have to realize what situation you're in before you understand what Islam requires of you. So there might be people who might not even really need to articulate the faith, because they just need to be ontologically sound, and they need to have their ethics in place, right? So there's a pre-faith place too, right? You understand what I'm saying? So so I really think that tasawwuf needs to be updated. Tasawwuf needs to be updated, and it also needs integration. So I'll come to this where there's Sunni tasawwuf and there's Shia irfan, and these are two beautiful perspectives that can be integrated. You understand what I'm saying? There can be enrichment from each other. So you need this sort of integration. Secondly, I'm moving on. I'm trying to give you a summary in this video, so I'm just going to move on. There's a lot more to be said, but I'm kind of So the second is that in Islamic philosophy, there's a couple big questions, and I'll just put the questions in front of you. So first off, um, are pure mathematics discovered or invented? Are they discovered or invented? Right? So, we have this thing where pure mathematicians will sit down and they'll come up with a system of mathematics or a system of logic or a system of concepts, right, that are purely rational, and they'll prove them from first principles, and they'll take pride in the fact that there is no empirical phenomenon that they're describing. This is purely intellect, right? But what'll happen is a few years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later, there'll be some empirical phenomena in the world which will be governed by and describable by, right? Governed by if mathematics is discovered, and described by if mathematics is created. So described by this governed by these mathematical abstractions, right, that have come into existence or been articulated by people 30 to 40 years before, or a century before, whatever it is. And what they find is that um, uh, this happens repeatedly, and so you find one phenomena that is governed by it, then you find many phenomena which are completely different from one another but governed by the same mathematical system, right, that was a pure abstraction. And then this process repeats, so it's not just for one mathematical system, it's for many mathematical systems, and this has happened repeatedly enough to where we can say that there is something that is being discovered rather than created, right? If it was a creation, not every single one would find correspondence so consistently, but because there's something being discovered through the intellect. So what is the ontology of the intellect accessing these subtle truths beyond phenomena which actually describe phenomena, right? What is this capacity? What is the relationship of the intellect with those truths, and what is the ontological reality of those truths, right? So for a Muslim, we have this idea of 7 heavens, right? And so the first heaven is the heaven with the stars, right? And then the second, third, fourth, these heavens are more subtle, they're more abstract, right? And so for me, it is the intellect having access to these higher heavens. And there's a lot that can be said. So basically, in Islamic philosophy, there is today a need not only to criticize Western philosophy and to respond to it positively with Islamic philosophy, but there's also, in regard to science, the need to provide an Islamic or Quranic ontology with rigor, not like fluffy, right? Not with rigor, an Islamic or Quranic ontology to scientific concepts. So another way to say this is to provide a Quranic philosophy of the secular sciences, or to make meaningful quantum theory, make meaningful evolutionary theory by contextualizing it within a Quranic ontology properly, not in a fluffy way, but with precision and rigor, right? So this is kind of the general gist of it, but I've already kind of in the math. So there's a couple questions. So you get the general gist. I'll put a couple questions in there for you, like, is mathematics discovered or invented? I'll put those. So the second question is, in quantum theory, is the universe chaotic or orderly? So obviously, if as a Muslim you believe in the glorious throne of God, and that every moment you believe in an occasionalist metaphysics where every moment God is the one determining or at least permitting what occurs, right? Then obviously you believe in an orderly universe, right? You cannot believe in the chaotic, maybe multiverse leaning. You have to believe in a deterministic sort of school, right? No, there's in actuality there is this universe, and those other possible universes don't exist because God is the force who determines where the particle, which we can only know probabilistically through quantum theory, is deterministically determined to be, where it actually occurs, right? So this sort of question, I won't go into details, or you guys probably know what I'm talking about. Thirdly is the question, if this is, I don't know quite where to place this, maybe it goes between the last two questions. Is matter affected by meaning? So if you're a yogi, you would say yes, matter is affected by meaning, and there's actually plenty of studies that show that matter is affected by meaning. So meaning does have impact on matter, right? And there's more. And as a Muslim, one way I would definitely say yes to this also. But like magic is basically purposefully, intentionally going against divine order, creating perverse and grotesque art of some kind, and by that eliciting some sort of evil force, or the forces opposite to divine order, right? So we do believe in magic, and there's also like a science magic. There's a science to magic, right? It can be understood, right? And so anyways, so meaning does have impact on matter. And then fourthly is evolutionary biology, right? Can evolutionary biology, if we understand two principles, that given the laws of thermodynamics, evolution is actually acting against, it's going toward lesser entropy rather than more entropy. Now life, once it's born, goes to higher, it goes against entropy for a while, and then it goes toward entropy, right? But evolutionary process seems to always be going toward higher order. So against the laws of thermodynamics, there's something happening. And on the quantum mechanical level, if we believe in the occasionalist metaphysics, or the orderly schools of, like the Bohmian schools of interpreting quantum theory, or something like that, deterministic schools of interpreting quantum theory, where on the quantum mechanical level, there is no force to tell us, there is no explanation for why a particle appears where it appears. There's only a probabilistic understanding of it, but that the reason it appears what it appears is because God determines it to be there, or the throne of God determines it to be there. Right. So if you have that understanding on a physics level, then mutation can never be random. It must always be intentional, and therefore evolution is willed. And if evolution is willed, is the Quranic language, this, if you really appreciate the subtlety of the Quranic language, not only not contradicting the evolutionary narrative, but is it actually articulating the evolutionary narrative? And I say yes, and I can provide such coherent proofs for this, so many proofs for this, that the Quran is actually articulating, not only contradicting, but actually articulating the evolutionary narrative very precisely, with a lot of subtlety, a lot of rigor. That anyway, so this is one question of Islamic metaphysics, or Islamic kalam, Islamic modern philosophy, you could say, right? Okay. The next question is evolutionary biology. Okay, so then you have questions of social thought. Please give me a second. I will pause. Okay, so you have questions of Islamic social thought, which I'm skipping for now. Then you get to questions about AI. You get to questions about technology and AI. And so basically, when we come to AI, there's these challenges. So the Quran believes like it's self-evidently true that Adamic nature can recognize its self-evident truth. but also it does appeal to reason and intellect to some degree also. And one of the challenges it offers, which is more empirical rather than rationalist, right? There's a proof that it challenges any person who disbelieves in the Quran, and provides these challenges at three instances, at three moments in the Quran. And one of them is that the Quran is challenging if all the human beings and all the demons gathered and supported each other the best they could. So the idea of synergy is kind of the idea is they reinforced each other the best they could. They could not produce a speech like the Quran, and there's something exceptional about the Quranic speech. And I usually I put that first. Maybe I'll do a separate video on it this time because it gets complicated. But there is something exceptional, so the miracle can be experienced. There's something about the Quran that is like Moses parting the seas. There's something about it, right, which you can appreciate, which can be appreciated, which can be witnessed. It's a miracle that can be seen, right? So it's a sort of empirical challenge, and the challenge is that if you don't believe this to be from God, you believe it's magic or believe it's some it's composition over time or whatever it is, whatever your explanation is for what the Quran is in its exceptionalism, you do it too. You produce something like it. If you can explain how the Quran came to be, you reproduce something like it. So the question is, what would be considered like it? And that's why this requires a separate video. But the idea is, now I'm going to try to take the like, as a non-believer, provide a strong man argument, right? So I'm a believer, but as a non-believer, I'm going to provide a strong man response. Like, what is the most comprehensive way of responding to this challenge, right? And what the Quran is saying, that challenge is going to fail. Like, when you do it, you're going to discover that your explanation could not produce a speech like this, and therefore it'll be proven that you can't falsify. Your best effort to falsify the claim of the Quran being divinely articulated cannot be accomplished. You cannot falsify the Quran's claim, and you can do whatever you want. So I'm giving you the strongman argument. So imagine we have another couple hundred years on this planet. Artificial intelligence is absolutely matured, and quantum computing is absolutely matured, and robotics have absolutely matured as a field. And so basically you have this quantum computer which is capable of using every single particle in the universe as a bit, right? Every single particle in the universe has a bit, and you've installed the most advanced AI possible onto it, like 300 and 400 years from now, the most advanced AI onto that quantum computer. And that AI is then is fed all the recorded data that has ever been recorded, all the recorded data that has ever been recorded over the next few centuries and in the past. And then it has robotics. It has infinite robotics. It can produce its own robotic extensions, and those robotics can go out and get more data as it needs. So it has kind of like a body. It has this celestial sort of body. It can move about, right? Can a computer like that articulate in the manner speech that is like the Quran in a substantial way? And obviously the atheist would immediately say yes, but that's because they don't really have the appreciation of the Quran. And so this, to really kind of talk about this, you have to I really, as a believer, have to explicate what I mean to be like the Quran, and what is that exceptionalism that is being pointed to. What would falsify it and what would verify it? What would falsify it and what would verify it, right? That is there, right? So we would have to talk about that. But what like simply put here, just for the purposes here, what I'm saying is that that type of computer could also not falsify the claim of the Quran being miraculous or divine or inhuman, at least, right? You can't falsify that the Quran is not something that is within human capacity to produce, right? So that gives you some of the overview of Islamic philosophy and kind of the questions and concerns of evolved Islamic integral philosophy today, right? Now, coming to the system, right? Coming to the system, like social sciences, or in the domain of political science, or in the domain of Islam. So we've talked about Islam as spirituality, Iman as philosophy, and now we have to talk about our thought system, belief system, and now we have to talk about Islam as a system and a behavior, or like an like an external system, or a behavior, or a political system, a socioeconomic political system. And so basically here there's two thoughts. So first there is the garden in which Adam existed, right? Secondly, there is the return to the garden that the prophet established in Arabia by the time of his passing away. As a side note, there's also the gardens. There are also the gardens that were established by the prophets of old once they migrated, like Noah. Noah reestablished the garden, right? So every prophet kind of reestablished the garden, but the prophet our prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did it to a higher degree, and it was meant to be global, to reestablish the garden globally. And then, so what we have to do is we have to study that kind of archetypal garden of Adam, the Quranic narrative about it, and then the prophet's life, and what we mean by the garden that existed at the end of his life, and that theopolitical model, where the sovereignty, there's no sovereign immunity, only God is sovereign. The people are his representatives, and the government is their agent or their slave. Right, so that's kind of the proper way of looking at it for us. And so, like, looking at that model that existed and extrapolating in the language, in the technical language of the modern social sciences, what that model would look like and how it would be extrapolated globally, how it would look for there to be a global Islam. What would that look like? What would be its purposes and values and systems, and all to articulate that, right? From the model of the prophet in Arabia, extrapolating out. And also here, before I scare you too much, this is only going to be accomplished at the hands of Imam al-Mahdi and Christ. Right? This is what Christ is going to do. This is what Imam al-Mahdi are going to do. So the question then becomes, what is the gradualist struggle? What is the gradualist struggle, like I described at the beginning, the four phases of Islamic thought, or four phases of revelation, which we're going through again. So what stage does Christ descend? What stage does Imam al-Mahdi appear? When does that happen in the struggle? And what are we responsible before that happens, and what will happen after that happens? So for me, the migration is the point we are kind of responsible for accomplishing, and after the migration happens, divine political leadership will be given. Divine political leadership was only given before, after the migration, and so we are responsible for coming to after the migration. So we have to determine what is the place to migrate to, and we have to evolve circumstances to the point where that migration is voluntarily invited by the state structure of that region. And so we have to go through a process, and we have to go through the same process of realizing God, the spiritual process, and articulating faith. Realizing God and articulating faith, and calling our own relatives and our own blood relatives and our tribes and our clans tribes, nations, to the truth, but in a way where we've realized the truth, right? We've realized God in our character, and in a way that we've very well articulated the significance of that to the world we live in, the ultimate ontological, metaphysical significance of that to the world we live in. And then once we migrate, then we get the legal consequences. Then we get the political leadership, right? So we have to get to that point where there's a clear, divinely ordained migration. There's a separation out where we've established proof against the global intelligentsia, the global people, and those people who are going to accept the faith have come to us and we've together migrated to this place, and that's where when then we establish law, and then there is military struggle, right? That's going to happen at some point, but before that we have to articulate the truth, we have to realize the highest degree of spirituality, then we have God will facilitate migration, and after the migration is when we have political Islam, real political Islam. Like Afghanistan might be some partial realization, Saudi Arabia might be some partial realization, Pakistan, but we're talking about like the ultimate real God ordained real thing again, right? When we're talking about that this is the process we go through. And then instead of there having a phase once that political law is established, instead of there being a phase where we're talking about the signs of the day of judgment, we're actually going to start experiencing the signs of the day of judgment, and all the Antichrist and all that sort of thing is going to start going on. Anyways, so articulating the gradualism of that process, and then fourthly, for me, this is like, so the first one is spiritual work, the second is philosophical work, third is a jurisprudential work, right, mostly. But fourthly, we also need a narrative. We need a narrative, a grand narrative, starting from why creation happened in the first place, going through the stages of creation, to the stages of what my teacher calls cosmological evolution, geological evolution, biological evolution, primatological evolution, and then divine history. Once Adam is appointed as the vice regent of God, or the steward of the earth, then there's a revelatory history of not of Homo sapiens, but the children of Adam. So the story of the children of Adam, the biblical narrative, but not from a Christian view or a Jewish view, from a Muslim view. And then we understand the prophet's life in the light of the biblical narrative, and then we understand Islamic history. Now this is where I have something, this is where integral theory comes in, and this is where I have a unique insight. So for me, when you have justice and you have divergence from like divine justice, so the prophet is divine justice, all the prophets are divine justice, and once they pass away, because he was the final prophet, he had priests who succeeded him. He didn't have prophets who succeeded him. He had priests. Now, so there's a divergence that happens during the lives of those 12 priests from perfect truth, from perfect justice. And so those are Islamic idealism and Islamic pragmatism. So you have those two divergences happen at the prophet's passing, and then again and again during the lives of those 12 priests, high priests, right? And so those divergences create Islamic ideologies. So the original one is Muhakkimism and Proto-Sunnism, and the last one we can say is something like full-blown Sunnism and Shiism as we know it today. So you have this, I would say that the Ithna Ashari Shiism is in its origin is idealistic, and then Sunnism in its origin is pragmatic, right? But then throughout the 1400 years, there's been a sort of those were the original thesis. So Islamic idealism and Islamic pragmatism are the original two theses which diverged from the truth, and the two theses immediately start producing two antitheses and then two syntheses, and those two syntheses are closer to the truth than the divergent theses, right? But that every time there's a sin or some sort of major wrong or something, there's again two theses, there's again a new divergence, right? So there's a complexification of this simple process, but over time there's two streams, right? There's two streams, there's the original two, and there's another two, there's another two, and all of these are within the ummah as an entity, within the body of Christ or the body of the community. And so there's a dialectical process going on between every pair that's divergent to come to a point where the synthesis within subject to each thesis comes to a point where it re-identifies with the opposite synthesis. You understand? So independently, the synthesis has to come in both streams, has to come to a point where they re-identify with the synthesis of the other. Do you understand? And so this has to happen like so many, to go through so many cascading differentiations and whatever, to finally arrive where the truth is regathered, and the truth is regathered and it's re-identified. And so it's re-identified. So looking, so for me, Shiism, and it used to just be Shiism and Sunnism, are kind of like going through this process, right? But really, there's a much more detailed map of looking at this process, and I've constructed that map, right? And I do want to make more detailed videos in English, but I feel it might be beyond the pale. But what we see today is that you do have Sunni scholars who are going towards Shiism, or have integrated to a point where they're much more centrist, right? And you do have Shia scholars who have integrated to a point where they're much more centrist. And these centrist scholarship, there's been a tradition of centrism that has preserved the centrist, but these centrists were a result of the integrative process. They have the most intellectual veracity, right? They have the most intellectual vivaciousness, and they're basically they're more closer to each other than they are to the traditions or whatever, or to the traditional bodies of interpretations, right? Khomeini was something like this, Muhammad Iqbal, and we have Sayyid Salman Hussein Nadvi, and we have, these people. And so I believe we have to go through this integrative process. And so here I believe where Christian ecumenicism will necessarily fail, Islamic ecumenicism will necessarily succeed. It will necessarily succeed, and it will attain the ecumenical purposes or the integrative purposes. Also, I believe so. In the developmental trajectory of humanity, the West reached Islam reached proto modernity much before the West, but the West reached mature modernity much before the Muslim world, and then it spread the fruits of that. And but what I believe is that, again, what's going to happen is that Islam, or the Islamic world, will reach, even though the West went through post-modernity, is reaching proto-integralism. I think the Muslim world will reach full-blown integralism much before the Western world. There's something about the Quranic dialectic that is integrative in and of itself. And after the West has done what it's done, and it's failing, the West is failing as a civilization. And this is not this is just a observation, right? It's kind of failing, it's waning. And Islam is in the process of going up again. It's not like really gone up at all, but it's in the process. Someone who knows the internal dialectics can see that happening. It's in that process. So I feel that we're going to reach the integral stage, full blown, mature, because there's a coherence between the Quranic dialectics and integral. Because again, if you look at it just from a spiral dynamics, where tribalism is more identified with modernity, and modernity is more identified with integralism, and then post-modernity is most identified with traditionalism, that like alternation that goes on. Well, Islam was revealed to a tribal society, so there's a sort of inconsistency with traditionalism on a basic level, and then there is a coherence with modernity to some degree, like Lockean thought, and there's a coherence with integral evolutionary thought. Post-modernity and traditionalism is where Islam is trying to break the chains, really, like on a fundamental level. On more superficial levels, it may appear to be all sorts of different ways. Okay, so I think I'm going to end this video there. And if you have any questions, please like and subscribe below and comment. And I will respond to questions. And I will talk to you guys soon. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.